I am Laura Spate, Executive Director of the Policy Center. As we continue to advance the success of minority farmers, the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Research Center, located at Alcorn State University, is creating a series of video podcasts designed to educate minority farmers, ranchers, and agricultural professionals on agricultural policies impacting minorities and their communities. Each podcast will focus on an area of agricultural policy and its impact on minority farmers. Thank you.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Policy Center Live, presented by the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Research Center at Alcorn State University. Today's episode is going to focus on the Inflation Reduction Act and the possible changes it can bring for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. Today, we have with us a special guest, Mr. Lloyd Wright, who is a farmer and retired director of USDA's Office of Civil Rights. Welcome, Mr. Wright.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Wright. So we're going to just jump right in. Can you, before we get started talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do now? Okay.
Well, I'll start with what I'm doing now. And thanks for having me on this today. I'm a farmer at the present time. In Virginia, we grow row crops. This year we have soybeans planted. Prior to that, I worked 37 years at USDA. And my last 2 years, I was Director of Civil Rights for the Department of Agriculture. And I was the director during the time that Pigfoot lawsuit started, and retired in 1998 from the Department of Agriculture.
That means that you are the perfect person to discuss this recent Inflation Reduction Act and the possible benefits that can come from it. So before we get into some of the benefits that can come from it, can you possibly talk to us about what exactly the Inflation Reduction Act is?
Okay. The Inflation Reduction Act is actually the third attempt to try to address the discrimination of social disadvantaged farmers initially. Actually, if you go back one stage, some of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act originated in the Justice for Black Farmer Act that was initially drafted by Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Booker. And then eventually some of those provisions were changed to some extent and then included in the American Rescue Plan. And in that plan, it was an effort to address the debt and discrimination of social disadvantaged farmers. It changed from being Black as a Justice for Black Farmer Act to social disadvantaged farmers when we included it in the American Rescue Plan. In that plan, all social disadvantaged farmers with debt with USDA would have their debt written off, and 20% to address the taxes. In addition, there were funds provided to address farmers who had been subject to discrimination. And that has not been implemented, to say the least, in that over a period of time, a number of organizations filed lawsuits and stopped implementation of the American Rescue Plan, at least that provision on debt relief. Then an effort was made in the Build Back Better bill, which passed in the House but not Senate, to remove race because the lawsuits were based on the fact that a group of farmers were being given benefits based strictly on their race. So race was removed and other conditions listed that farmers would have to reach in order to get debt relief. And the provision on discrimination remained as well, but it was not limited to social disadvantaged farmers. It was open to all farmers subject to past discrimination. So then we move on to the third item, which is the one we're talking about today, inflation reduction. That's the third act. And so that act was designed, and the leadership came primarily from Senator Booker and Senator Warnock's office, to provide debt relief to social disadvantaged and other farmers. But instead of basing it on race, it's now based on the condition the farmers find themselves, whether or not they are subject to foreclosure or bankruptcy or more interest than principal, or have their loans reconstructed, a number of other kind of things that would indicate stress for boys. That is the condition now under which farmers would have their debt forgiveness. And this applied to all farmers. It's not black or white. And as a matter of fact, in the initial bill, there were only 8% of the black farmers have debt with USDA. So really, whether on any of the three bills I've talked about, the maximum blacks would have benefited would have been 8% of the farmers. The other 92% would have had to apply for the discrimination provisions that didn't have much money in it. So so from a historical standpoint, I would say this is the third attempt. And I would say that it's probably for black farmers and social disadvantaged farmers, it's probably better than the first two, in that the maximum, again, that debt relief can be provided is going to be limited to those who have debt. However, whereas we were probably looking at something like $250 million for discrimination claims, the Inflation Reduction Act has $2.2 billion, which is a significant amount of money. So that's where we are from a historical standpoint with the three attempts. This is a third attempt, and hopefully this one will be implemented.
Wow, that was wonderful. And I thank you so much for actually not only talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, but also going through the pieces of legislation that have led up to the Inflation Reduction Act. So my next question for you, Mr. Wright, you mentioned that you were the director of USDA's Office of Civil Rights, and you were there during Pickford. So what do you think that the Inflation Reduction Act will be historically significant for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, or do you think that there will need to be more legislation to correct a lot of the issues and things that are taking place with socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers?
Yes. The Inflation Reduction Act will not change policy in the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Ag is often referred to as the last plantation. And the reason for that, it really doesn't change much from one administration to another. And it's never been very open to providing services to primarily black farmers. The historical discrimination that's been documented, at least in the Department of Agriculture, really relates to black farmers, the racial discrimination. So, there's been a number of things promised to blacks, and I tell folks, starting with the 40 acres and a mule that they never received, or the land redistribution that was going to occur that was a bill passed and Lincoln had signed, but Johnson refused to implement. And then effort was made in Pigfoot where farmers were to get compensation, debt relief, and priority for future programs. A handful of farmers got $50,000. Only 371 farmers got debt relief. Some kind of way the department and others figured out how not to provide debt relief to Black farmers. And even like less than 100 of them got any priority for future services. So if you want to go back and talk about Pigfoot, it was poorly implemented, like the others that were not implemented at all. And then the American Rescue Plan, which really would have helped the 8% of the Black farmers who have debt with USDA, that was never implemented either. So I almost have to look at this bill as being an excellent piece of legislation, similar to some of the other policies that have been passed along the way in the last 150 years. But if we implement this at the pace that we implemented all of the other policies I just mentioned, it won't help socially disadvantaged farmers, Black farmers, or anyone else. So the real concern that we have then is that we implement the policy and do it in a way that benefit the maximum number of social disadvantaged and other farmers under stress. But it won't change the fact that we have county committees out there and hiring folk at a local level. It's been outright discrimination. Every report that's been done, starting in '65 with the Commission on Civil Rights report, indicate clearly that the county committees were not good for Black farmers. We haven't changed it. Some of the other policies and programs that get included in farm bills based on the past record that Black farmers and other socially disadvantaged farmers find themselves into is used as a reason not to provide loans. So it turns out that we've worked ourselves into a corner where only 8% of the Black farmers were able to get loans. And so the rest of the farmers are operating with funds from elsewhere or none at all and not doing well. So that needs to be fixed. That has to be done in the Farm Bill. Transparency does not exist. The bill was passed and a provision was included in the 2008 Farm Bill requiring the department to put in a note for each person provided services with a status code as to their race, sex, and et cetera. That has not been implemented. So if we don't do transparency, we really don't know the extent to which, Blacks are not and other minorities are not provided services because we're really not even counting it anymore.
That sounds very significant. I know that one thing that you mentioned was transparency, and that is something that we have seen a lot of coming out, that there needs to be more transparency, record keeping, access to, records, especially records of discrimination and reports of discrimination. And I know that you mentioned the county committees. That has been a very hot topic when discussing, especially with socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers and Black farmers and ranchers, their success in farming. So one thing that I want to ask you next, I know that we talked about like what was included in the Inflation Reduction Act, what possible changes this could bring to socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, but what about the communities that socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers serve? What benefits can fully implementing this piece of legislation, what benefits can this bring to the communities that surround socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers? I think a lot of times we just think about the actual farming, but not that these farmers and ranchers support entire communities.
Yeah, well, for one thing, hopefully it will help keep some of our social disadvantaged, well, let's say Black farmers, because I think when we mix social disadvantaged farmers with the other races, it's difficult to make very direct statements and be factual in that, we talk about the fact that there's a decline, and we like to say of socially disadvantaged farmers. That is really not true. There's a decline of Black farmers, and Blacks have declined from almost 1 million farmers down to 38,000. But since we've been keeping records, most of the other minority groups are increasing. So I have to be careful how I answer the question about the benefit of trying to save socially disadvantaged farmers. Really, we need to save Black farmers, and with no difference to the others. However, the others are not declining; they are increasing actually. So the benefit would be if we can save a few of the Black farmers in the Black communities. As you well know, that money will turn over, 10, 15 times if we can keep Black farmers actively on their farms in their communities. And we haven't done that well. I mean, since 1920, Black farmers have been declining and their communities have been falling apart. And in some places, there are communities where half of the people in those Black communities, small towns, are unemployed. And if there was active Black farms in that region, that money would come back to those areas, and there would be more activity, and that money would be turning over in their communities. So it would save and help some of the communities if we could save some of them. But the number has declined. It's a very small number. And the fact that there would only be, slightly over 3,000 farmers at most receiving debt relief, tell you that, that there's not that many farmers getting services, at least loan services from the Department of Ag. So that's something that need to be worked on. This bill, it would almost be like putting your thumb in the dike. It might help a little bit, but we need some major changes in the farm bill and to really address issues that have been identified, for a long time. 50, 60 years has been well documented that the programs, the way and the policies and the hiring, decision-making process and the lack of accountability, all of that was not in the best interest of Black farmers and other minorities. But we haven't changed it. Even when we've been able to get policy put in the farm bill, it's not implemented. So if you don't implement the policy, it won't help. So, but we're hoping that at least we'll stop the bleeding and we'll save a few of the remaining farmers in their communities, and therefore it definitely will help the whole community.
So, Mr. Wright, I know that you mentioned the small number of Black farmers specifically who actually were able to obtain loans from USDA. Where are other Black farmers financing for the operation of their farms?
Well, I'm not sure, but let me tell you some of the sources. There are a few farmers who are using their credit cards if they have room left on the credit card. Not a very good way to purchase grain, fertilizer, and et cetera. There are farmers who, borrow money from family if they can. A few of them can get some money from banks at high interest rates. And many of them really shortchange their operations, in that they don't get the seed would give them the highest production. They don't always put on the needed fertilizer and lime. The equipment is in poor shape. They're operating on a shoestring. So they're getting their money from expensive sources or not getting it at all. And the farms are deteriorating in that they can't maintain the equipment and other things on the farm because they don't have the resources to do it. So really need to be examined. I'm hoping that a study will come out to really identify all the sources of money, but not from the federal government. And the federal government was supposed to be, the lender of last resort when you couldn't get money elsewhere, but it's not that for Black farmers anymore. And it's been declining, steady declining for Black farmers. For the last 20 years, it's been going down. So a study is necessary to look at that, or oversight hearing or something. But it's not working well for Blacks. The loans are not working well. Now, some of them have been in trouble because Pigfoot, I mentioned Pigfoot as it relates to Black farmers.
Yeah.
You know, and when I was director of civil rights, on 100% of the cases I settled, when I said the farmer was going to get debt relief, I meant debt relief. If they had two loans, they got debt relief on both of them, even if they had a rural development loan. When they left the settlement table, they did not owe a nickel to the Department of Ag. In Pigfoot, they figured out how to give partial. When I say they got 371 loan forgiven, that were 371 people. Many of them only got their small loans forgiven. The large ones, they didn't. And some of the farmers who were informed by their attorneys that they were going to have their debt forgiven and therefore they didn't need to pay, believed that and stopped paying. But at the end of a 4 or 5 year period before they made a final decision on who would get debt relief, they found that they didn't get debt relief and they owed interest and penalties, and they've been in a hole ever since. So to a large extent, Pigfoot probably hurt more Black farmers than it helped. And they weren't careful about who they paid. Something we hope to do a better job, depending on how they implement the discrimination complaints in the new bill, to make sure we screen out and pay just farmers. And that didn't happen either. So it's been a tough road for especially for Black farmers, and the fact that policies designed and programs to help them have not been properly implemented has been made it even worse. And so I always tell farmers, if with no regard to what you promise, if you can continue to service and pay your loan, do so, because you don't have a benefit until you receive it. Just because it's in the law and passed don't mean you're going to get it. And I'm not 100% sure, although I think the American, I think the Inflation Reduction Act is the best of the three and would do a lot to help Black farmers. I'm not convinced necessarily it's going to happen. If the longer you wait, the more I'm convinced it's probably not going to happen. And that Martin Luther King once said that to tell Black folk to wait is to say never. And that's what happened with the first bill. We waited until lawsuits stopped it. If we don't move this one out, the same thing could happen. So I'm not convinced that we have a good bill. I'm not convinced it's going to have a good benefit. We don't have benefits until it's implemented. And that's up to the Department of Agriculture. And they don't have a good history of implementing policy relating to Blacks.
Mr. Wright, what is, I see, as you discussed, the Inflation Reduction Act is great, but there's still a long way to go. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, what should socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, Black farmers, community-based organizations, institutions that serve, these farmers and ranchers, what is one part of the IRA that we should really be focused on and looking at and paying attention to and keeping up with? If you could just pick one area of the Inflation Reduction Act.
If I had to pick one, I would say they should pay attention to the discrimination provision, which is a revision of the Section 1006E of the Inflation Reduction Act. And the reason I say that is that for Black farmers, at least, I don't care how you cut the pie, the maximum number of farmers who can benefit is 8% of the Black farmers. The other 92% can't benefit because they don't have debt. They didn't make loans to Black folks. So if Black farmers didn't get loans, there's no debt to be forgiven. So for that group of farmers, the only relief they can receive will have to come from the discrimination provision where we have $2.2 billion. So I think once the rules are published and guidelines for implementation of that provision have been published, we need to work with the community-based organizations and hopefully get them trained so they can help farmers fill out the applications, because applications will be needed for this. You can't just hand out the money. Farmers will be. But first of all, we'll have to determine whether or not they're farmers. In this case, we're hoping that they'll have a process in place to verify that you're dealing with a farmer before we start processing it, and not waste our time on folk who want to get in for a payment who are not and never been farmers. Then the second thing, we have to decide whether or not they've had discriminatory actions happen to them. And then when that is done, we need to determine the amount. And they can get from $1 to $500,000. So it's $500,000 was put in as the limit that we can pay a farmer. So I think that provision is the one that can help the other 92% of Black farmers for sure. And that's the one we need to concentrate and spend most of our time on. The department has all the information they need to implement the debt forgiveness. They know the extent to which farmers fit in the categories that could trigger debt relief. Once they decide, the recommendations have been made for a definition for distressed farmers for debt relief. To my knowledge, the USDA has not put out anything. So hopefully they'll follow the recommendations. The Policy Center provided them with some recommendations. So hopefully they'll follow that and get that done. But I'm not so sure how much more community-based organizations can do now except encourage the department to move on swiftly and get it done. But there's a lot they can do, community-based organizations and others, on the discrimination part. For sure, they can help farmers fill out the application, but prior to that, they have to help inform the farmers that this provision is available, and understand it and explain to farmers the conditions under which they should be able to apply. And then for those who elect to apply, hopefully the community-based organizations can help them complete those applications. So that they have a major role that they should and hopefully will play. Some of the farmers might not have internet, but hopefully the community-based organizations will, and they can help farmers fill them out. So that's the portion that we got to concentrate on, because we need to look at the 92% and not just the 8%.
I think that is a really good place to start, just because I know that a lot of conversations that take place, a lot of farmers and ranchers, especially Black farmers and ranchers, are constantly talking about possible discrimination that they faced, especially those farmers and ranchers that have been farming and ranching over a significant amount of years. Just very quickly, just to kind of follow up with that, what about the 1890 land grant institutions? What role do you think they can play in this Inflation Reduction Act and bringing change to socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers?
Well, I think if we get to the implementation of this particular act, well, I think there's two things. One is the role they could play in implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, and the other is the role they can play overall in helping Black farmers. We are hoping that, depending on what kind of system is put together, that the 1890s will participate in providing services either to farmers or to the group that help decide the benefits, helping them figure out their losses so that they can qualify for the maximum amount of benefits that they deserve to receive. So the schools and the ag economists available should be able to help them with that. And then, like the community-based organizations, they have an extension service where they should be able to go out and do both educational work and provide assistance, just like the community-based organizations. And so hopefully they will do both of those things. And then I think, but for long term, with the 1890s, and some of them are doing that, it started to work with more of the black farmers on probably niche crops. Many of the black farmers, have smaller land holdings and not necessarily able to do row crops. So they're going to have to do other kind of crops that they might need, more assistance and services from the 1890s and getting them into those kind of crops that may be more labor intensive and not necessarily dependent on land and equipment because they don't have that now. So and they're doing that already in some places, but they need to further emphasize that. And then I think with their research programs, hopefully they can come up with the kind of things that have impacted the black farmers so that we can have the kind of information that we need to go to Congress and ask them to do the kind of things that need to be done in farm bills to correct some of the things that have happened in the past. And that I often think we need a catch-up program in that, when when I came along and by the time that I finished college in 1964, I was born in the Deep South in the state of Virginia. And, I couldn't stay in a motel or eat in a restaurant. And depending on where the USDA office is located, maybe I couldn't even go in that part of the town. So the segregation, at least against blacks, in my early part of my life was legal. The state had laws, you get arrested and thrown in jail for doing the wrong kind of things and not staying in your place, as they would have put it. Well, they're farmers my age and older who suffered those benefits, those indignities and losses. And we need to do the research on what kind of catch-up program we need to get to do to level the field some. We're never going to get what they deserve. You can't restore, hundreds of years of oppression with one swipe, but at least we can document what went wrong and try to outline those kind of things that we can do to try to mediate some of the things that went wrong. So I'm hoping that 1890s work on that, and some of them are.
Okay, great. That reminded me, there's a large discussion going around about, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps, argument going on. And when you said, the 1890s really working to figure out a way for these black farmers to catch up, there's no one, button fixes everything. But I think that is very significant. And I'm glad that you mentioned that. So I have one more question for you, Mr. Wright. And it's just, is there anything else that you think that we should know about the Inflation Reduction Act, be on the lookout for as it pertains to the Inflation Reduction Act, or just anything else that you'd like to discuss about the Inflation Reduction Act?
The act itself, I think, is great. I think the two senators who provided the leadership for doing this did an excellent job. And although some might be concerned that it didn't do everything that they wanted done, I think we have to deal with the art of what's possible at the present time. Some would like to have seen included in the bill that black farmers or pigfoot farmers would automatically get their debt written off. But that was already in the courts. And until you figure out how you're going to get through that system, which was probably going to last a lot longer than many of us, it wasn't going to happen. I mean, the race-based thing had already been put in the court system, and it wasn't moving very fast. So I think that I would have to say that the Inflation Reduction Act, considering the conditions that existed at the time, did as much as you can do to help folk who are in stress on loans. So that's a big benefit. It puts significant money on the table for dealing with past discrimination, like almost 10 times what was being discussed prior to this act. So the potential for doing something is there. And then another benefit is that it removed the Section 1005, which was the basis for the lawsuits, and eliminated those lawsuits. They weren't going anywhere. I think they had potential of leading to bad places. And I think that that's the third benefit, to have gotten rid of those lawsuits that were not necessarily in our best interest. Under better circumstances, maybe we could have fought those cases and won them, but I don't see that in the cards for now. So I consider a benefit to eliminate it. To eliminate that lawsuit is also a benefit. So those are the three benefits. Putting money over for discrimination, where the 92% in terms of blacks and other groups who have been discriminated against can come in and apply. It's not all blacks, of course, but blacks have been historically discriminated against more than any other group. It has been documented to have been discriminated against. It's the only group that has a certified class for discrimination against the Department of Agriculture. So I would say that, with that being the case, having put significant money in the program for discrimination is great for the bill. But my real concern is that if we sit around and don't implement it, it'll be like the 40 acres and a mule we're still waiting for. So I tell folk that the legislators have done their job and created a great bill. There won't be any benefits until the administration implement the bill, and to wait is to create a situation where it'll never happen. All of the other things that we're aware of, where programs and were put together to suggest helping black farmers, including those who had just come out of slavery, never happened, because by waiting for a little bit, folk figured out how not to do it. And that happened with Pigfoot. They waited. The Clinton administration had a clear, idea on how to fix the situation with black farmers with debt relief and payments, but it didn't happen. Someone else got to administer that. And if we do the same thing with this bill, it'll probably just be added to the list of other historically deplorable list of programs not implemented. So I think the bottom line is that we now have to convince the administration that with a good piece of legislation, they got to implement it soon and put some people working on it. And soon mean, I don't know why farmers who are distressed should have any debt at the end of this month. I don't know why the department can't figure out how to get that done, or why they shouldn't get that done. And there should be organizations by the end of October. There should be organizations out there getting ready to, because they're going to be. I didn't mention that there'll be private entities implementing the discrimination provisions. That will not be done by USDA. It will be done by one or more private entities. So I don't know why they are not being selected probably by the end of October, so we can get started. You can't finish, the program until you start it, and they haven't started them yet. So I think I would say the public need to put, to let the department know that in addition to all the other things they're doing, it's important that they get this program done.
I really agree with you on that. I think time is of the essence, especially when we have so many people out there, struggling and really needing help right now. Mr. Wright, I want to thank you again for joining us today. It is always amazing to have you on and just to speak to you. You are just such a wealth of knowledge. And I'm glad that not only could you share your wealth of knowledge with me today, but to anyone who tunes in and listens to this episode. Again, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.